I spent the next few days at home. Most of my time was spent practicing with the liquid steel, as I preferred to call it, adding another 3 days worth of it to my collection. I now had a fair amount of it, and my practice with it was yielding good results. According to Nylea, it was important to get as much practice with it as I could. The effectiveness at which I can shift its form and size, change it from fluid to solid and back again, how quickly I could make it obey my will. All of these things would be important when it came down to a life or death combat situation, and I was getting fairly good at it. It had gotten to the point where I could almost not pay attention to it and still do the basic exercises. Watch TV whilst mindlessly shifting the liquid back and forth in my hands, changing its shape and status. After Nylea told me the story about one of her previous hosts, I started experimenting with just how versatile this fluid could be, and I was quite frankly blown away. It seemed to be basically whatever I wanted it to be. I could make it as hard as steel or the liquid that it was to begin with, and move as either. But I could also make it hold in between forms, things that weren't exactly solid or liquid. For example, I could make it maintain sort of a consistency that you'd probably attest to the gel insoles that you find in shoes, making them soft and malleable, squishy like the gel. And if I did so, it actually had a fair amount of bounce to it. My first attempt at trying to make it imitate cloth was an utter failure. It more or less just became a steel sheet. It appeared that the only way to make it into cloth was to actually use a strand by strand method. Basically, imagining a fine thread and stretching out that thread as much as possible, and then weaving that thread into a cloth, which was a very time-consuming process. But after making it into a cloth, as long as I didn't change its shape or try to shift it out of the cloth form back into a liquid, I could still manipulate the cloth to a great degree, making it become rigid or solid at will, and then go right back to being just as cloth-like as before. I could even affect the outward texture of it. If I wanted to, I could make a solid object feel more coarse or smooth to the touch, create that gel-type substance to give things grip or ease of handling. And I found, while in their solid shape, they were just as pliable in the forms as any regular metal. For example, if I made a nut and a bolt, I could easily put the two together, the same way you would with a regular steel nut and bolt. And they function the same way. According to Nylea, regardless of what form I give the material, it always maintains its overall strength, which according to her is basically absurd, having an absolutely crazy threshold for dampening impacts, resistance to heat, chemical reactions, even having resistance to the cold. Quite frankly, it really defied logic. For the time being, my supply was fairly limited, but that wasn't the main problem that I was facing when it came to this. If I was going to be able to use it, I needed a way to carry it around with me. And having a giant stream of floating silver liquid around you isn't exactly inconspicuous. So I began to try a myriad of things that might help me carry some of the material around with me. My first attempt was actually a great success. Basically, creating duplicates of all of my piercings. My nose piercings and eyebrow piercings, lip piercings, ear piercings. Creating duplicates and putting them in. Next, I tried adding a few extra touches. as I didn't think the piercings were gonna do. That's simply not enough of it. So I began adding other things like belt buckles, wallet chains, and such. Things that were fairly inconspicuous, but that could easily pass for regular metal, that anyone might carry around with them. The fact that I was into rock actually made it a bit easier on me. There are lots of metal accessories that rockheads tend to carry around and wear throughout their clothing. So finding some places where I could squeeze metal bits in was fairly simple in the beginning. But after getting the more basic things, the more I began to add, the more ridiculous it started to look. And since I'm not the type of guy who wants to walk around with spiked metal shoulders and knee pads, I decided against those. In the end, just going with some stylish metal plating for my shoes that I thought fit in pretty well with my general style, and some very nice chains that I thought fit fairly well too. Not so much that it looks gaudy, but enough that I think it's still passable in fashion. Next, I included some wristbands of a fairly wide range of designs and types, and last but not least, some rings to go on my fingers. All, of course, heavy metal themed. Afterwards, it appeared that I was carrying a fair amount of it with me, so in an emergency situation, I could probably use it. But it still wasn't enough. There was no way this was going to be suitable for if I ran into some serious bad trouble, like another symbiote and their host. I needed a way to carry around more, but was running lackluster on ideas. I thought about, of course, sewing my liquid steel into thread and then using it to make clothing. The problem with that being that I can't manipulate it afterwards. It has to stay clothing, because if I turn it into a liquid again, I'm basically running around clothless, which is not the image I want to present. So for the moment being, I was at a roadblock as to how to carry more of it with me. So I spent some time making some calls, calling my boss and telling him that I would be out of work for a little while, and making some calls to some of those talk shows and the mayor, trying to make sure they were still interested, and scheduling the little events in question. I definitely needed the money. I was eating myself out of house and home at this point. And then there was one more problem. The problem being, I've never been in a fight in my life. I wouldn't even know how to. I mean, I'm 10 times as strong as I should be, and have superhuman reflexes. And for some reason, still, the idea of getting into a fist fight doesn't seem appealing to me, even with a normal person. I suppose maybe I'm just not the fighting type. But that doesn't stop the case from being I'm going to have to fight, because I doubt that the supervillains are going to hand over their symbiotes just because I asked nicely. No, I'd need to take them by force, which means I was going to have to fight, and hard, because they weren't going to be pulling their punches. So, the question is, what to do about it? Okay, I said to myself, standing in the front room. I've got enough experience with the liquid, and I am 10 times as strong as I should be, with superhuman reflexes. Maybe I should go try to handle a normal crime, something lacking the superpower category, to get me warmed up, so to speak, and maybe get me used to the idea of actually fighting. I mean, when you have superpowers, taking on a basic criminal shouldn't be that hard. And the only question being, did I have the guts to do it? No, there's no time to question that. It's all or nothing. I have to get used to being able to fight bad guys. There's no other way around it.